right, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. Hold up. Sorry, one sec. There we go. All right, there it is. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us in the world. Thanks very much for taking some time with us today. And welcome back for day 3. So you have myself again, James Herbert. I again head up the sales engineering team here at Jumpcloud. Zach is going to be joining us a little bit later to kind of help out, but basically same type of format as yesterday. Feel free to use the question tool that GoToWebinar provides, and we'll stay on top of those and answer them as they come in. This is the agenda for today. I will say though, it's not set in stone. We probably won't use the entire time that we have allotted. And we have a little bit of a smaller crowd today, so it'll be a bit more intimate in the sense that we can focus more specifically on some of the questions or even specific use cases that y'all have or that are more interested in learning about. But basically, this is going to be a bit of a recap of what we learned yesterday, but then kind of a deeper dive into some of these specific product areas. And then also kind of looking at how to effectively demo these specific product areas, some common questions that you might get from your clients that you're trying to pitch this to, maybe some best practices, some gotchas, and things of that nature. So really, it's kind of, a round 2, if you will, covering a lot of the same things that we did yesterday, but just taking a closer look at some of these things and really helping to get y'all a little bit better equipped to present this to your clients. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump in. So let me pull up my other screen here. So first thing we'll talk about is just kind of user management overall, and including the multi-tenant portal, and then also kind of just all the various different aspects to user management in a single organization as well. So let me actually start with the MTP. So give me a moment to bring that up, and we will start there. So let me log out of this one. I'm gonna log into the MTP instead. So we'll start with the MTP because there's really not a ton to cover, and I kind of showed some of the key things yesterday, but really the biggest thing with respect to the MTP is kind of setting up your role-based access control and setting up folks for kind of the proper permissions when they're going to be working with your individual clients. So again, what I mean by that is when you have an MTP, and there you go. There's a new feature coming out for the MTP. So cool stuff coming there. We'll take a look and see a bit more about that also. So again, as you start to grow your business with Jumpcloud, and I'm assuming that folks in the audience, maybe some of you already have some clients on Jumpcloud, maybe some of you are brand new to it. So I'll kind of assume that as kind of a broad spectrum of listeners today. But as you kind of grow your Jumpcloud practice and kind of get it deployed to more and more of your clients, you'll begin to kind of build out this multi-tenant portal. And again, depending on the size of your practice, you may have multiple different techs. But in general, it's always best practice to use the concept of least privileged access, meaning only give people access to the bare minimum things that they need to have access to. And so that means that, say for example, you've got, like in this case, I've got 4 different clients in here, and maybe I've got a tech named Joe, and so I only want Joe to manage just the one organization instead of giving Joe access to all of the organizations. Now again, maybe you're not in that scenario. Maybe Joe needs to work with all of your clients, but as much as possible, it's always best to use that concept of least privilege access, right? So again, if we were going to create Joe as an administrator, we'll create a new admin here. We'll just call this Joe Tech, right? He has an email. And of course, multi-factor, it's probably preaching to the choir for this audience, but if you don't already have multi-factor on everything, you should, especially for privileged users like an administrator who has access to multiple different client environments. You'd want to enable that for your admins as you set them up. And then again, for permissions and access, this is where you can specify the role. So again, following the concept of least privilege access. Now, if Joe is going to be doing a full-on deployment for this client, then you probably want to make him at least an administrator. Your administrator with billing, you'd probably only want to use for, maybe your tech leadership within the organization or, something of that nature, but it's probably not Joe. Now, if Joe is, let's say this customer is, the client is already implemented, then, if there's not new configurations being made, then you may only need to make Joe a help desk user, right? Where they've basically got read-only access to the environment, but they can do things like help users with password resets or, resetting their MFA tokens and things of that nature. So again, as you kind of look to add administrators to the multi-tenant portal, best practices, use that principle of least privilege access to only give your administrators the kind of the bare minimum that they need to have access to, and use that type of concept. Now, the actual administrator roles, let's take a closer look at that, right? So if we go to admin roles, we'll come back to that in just a moment. But if we look at admin roles, we have in the knowledge base a matrix that shows all of the different privileges that each of the roles have, right? So again, if you're looking at admin versus an admin with billing versus just that help desk user, right? Sorry, they're across the top here, right? So the admin with billing is basically your super administrator. Administrator has almost the same stuff as the admin with billing, just can't do some of the things, right? Like modify other administrators, for example. And then again, like help desk is kind of like just for the folks who are answering help desk tickets, right? It's kind of what it sounds like. So it's mostly read-only. They can't really modify many things except for users. So you can use this matrix in this knowledge base article to kind of define and figure out what the best admin roles are for your administrators as you create them in the MTP. And so you can use that as a reference, but generally speaking, least privilege access is the appropriate model to follow here. Okay, so let's come back over here. All right, so that's the basics of that. And again, if this administrator is only going to be working with a specific organization, then you would only assign them to that organization. That's pretty straightforward. Okay, so those are really the big things with the MTP. I don't see any questions coming in for MTP stuff, so we'll just kind of keep on moving on. Okay, so back into kind of a single organization that we're looking at now, right? So again, we're kind of focusing on user management and directory integrations. I'm curious to know, maybe y'all can use the chat for this, but I have a question for you all. Like, how many of your clients are still on on-prem AD? How many are on Azure AD? How many are using Google Workspace? I'd be interested to kind of hear from the group, what your clients are on. So maybe if you could take a moment and drop a note into the chat to help me out there. There was a question that popped up. If an admin with billing is locked out, can another admin unlock their account? Another admin with billing would be able to unlock their account, yes, but it has to be another super admin. But if you only had other administrator roles, then no, the administrator role would not be able to modify other administrators. Only an admin with billing can modify other administrators. All right, thank you, Scott. Love the participation. So you have a fairly even split among on-prem, Azure AD, and Google Workspace. Okay, you're kind of a little bit of everything. We see that with a lot of our partners, and kind of what I've seen in the mix is that, a lot of MSPs will kind of, only operate in the Google universe or only operate within the Microsoft universe, right? So if you have an even split, then that's great. That means that, Jumpcloud's probably going to be a really great fit for some of your clients and maybe not as good of a fit for some of the others, right? I think where Jumpcloud shows or kind of has the most value is in mixed environments, right? If you're a Google and Mac shop, then it's a slam dunk, right? That's an easy one, right? If you're all Google and Mac, then Jumpcloud's going to be a huge win there. If you're 100% Microsoft, then might be a little bit tougher. You might have to look at specific use cases instead of doing the whole platform pitch. But there's probably still ways that we can find some value in there for those 100% Microsoft shops. And then for the mixed environments, again, that's another slam dunk because most of the other solutions out there are going to be point solutions that kind of focus on a single operating system. If you look at something like Jamf, for example, it's exclusively Mac. Intune is not 100% exclusively Windows, but pretty much is, right? So, whereas Jumpcloud's going to be agnostic. We got some other stuff coming in here. So no on-prem AD, just Google Workspace. Again, that's pretty much a slam dunk for Jumpcloud. If you're only on Google, whether or not it's all Mac devices or Mac and Windows, we're going to be a really good fit if Google Workspace is being used as really the only quote unquote directory service. And then, yeah, Stephen with another point. So Azure Id plus Octa Sso, unmanaged devices plus G Suite, very messy indeed. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And again, that's really probably the biggest kind of overall pitch for Jumpcloud and kind of the best selling point for Jumpcloud is like, that's a perfect example, Stephen. Like you have 4 or 5 different point solutions all doing different things, and it's tough to get them to all communicate with one another and get them to integrate with one another and to kind of make everything happy. Plus you're managing 4 different platforms, 4 different admin consoles. So yeah, that's really where the beauty of Jumpcloud comes in, is because we can simplify those things, consolidate everything into a single platform, single admin interface, and do all of those things, right? Across directory, SSO, managed devices, and more. Cool, very good. So kind of a mixed crowd, which is pretty standard. So I won't spend too much time on the on-prem AD stuff unless somebody wants me to, but nobody chimed in and said they have on-prem AD, so we'll kind of go over it quickly. But basically, this is obviously a lot of folks still have on-prem AD in place, right? Especially if they're older company that have been around for a while, they probably have on-prem AD. And a lot of companies are kind of looking to migrate away from on-prem AD or looking for ways that they can get off of on-prem AD. And so, we can provide some assistance on doing that. So there's basically 2 main things here that you need to deploy to get set up with this Active Directory integration. One is the AD import agent, and the other is the AD sync agent. Basically, now the import is kind of a one-way sync, right? That synchronizes users from AD into Jumpcloud, and that'll include, kind of all that user information, group information, things of that nature. We can pull those in from AD. And now the one thing about this is that it says passwords here. There's a bit of a caveat to be aware of here when it comes to syncing passwords from Active Directory. The way that this works is like when we initially install the import agent, and there's a few dependencies that go along with that as well. Like we can take a look at the prerequisites in a moment here to give you an idea for that. But once the AD import agent is set up and it's up and running, then what will happen is we create a Jumpcloud security group within Active Directory, and then when we add users into that security group, that is what causes them to sync up to Jumpcloud. Now, it actually does not synchronize the user passwords on that initial sync. So what has to happen in order for that password synchronization to occur is a password change has to happen within the domain. Right, so user changes their password within the domain, whether that's an admin doing it in ADUC or user doing it from Control-Alt-Delete menu, whatever the case may be. That user password has to occur after the import agent is installed, and only then does Jumpcloud obtain the AD password. So that's an important note. From that point, I mentioned yesterday that kind of once you get set up on Jumpcloud, then the easiest way to do it and kind of a best practice is to have Jumpcloud act as the authoritative directory, including for password changes. And that's where the AD sync agent comes into play, because this allows Jumpcloud to sync password changes from Jumpcloud to Active Directory. Okay. Now, if you have the Jumpcloud agent on your machines, installed on your machines, then users can do that password change from the actual agent itself right here from the Tray app, or they could do it from the user portal, right? So that's an important thing to note. The other kind of the other thing that's probably worthwhile to point out here as well is that if you have AD joined machines, right? If the workstations are actually bound to Active Directory, then in order to install the Jumpcloud agent, they need to be unbound from Active Directory first. So that's an important consideration as well. Now we have a migration utility that can help with that. That's the ADMU, but it's an important consideration, right? That's for a lot of old school IT folks that telling them that they have to unbind their machines from AD might be a bit scary. So tread cautiously when you're qualifying opportunities around that type of a thing. But but it makes sense when you think about it, right? You have either the machine is being authenticated against Active Directory, or it's being authenticated against Jumpcloud. You can't really have both. So that's an important thing to call out as well. I'll kind of quickly go through, some of the prereqs and setup here. But again, one of the first things here is that it does need to be installed on a domain controller. You'll need to have a few things that are kind of set up here, ready to go. I mentioned that you need to have a security group configured that's called Jumpcloud, and then add users to that security group for the ones that you'd like to synchronize over. And so there's kind of a few other considerations. Again, we don't need to go through this in its entirety unless anybody wants me to, but it doesn't seem like there's a ton of folks that are out there that are using on-prem AD. So it's all well documented, and it's relatively straightforward. But if you do take a stab at doing the deployment here, I would just recommend reading through the KB first, because there's a few kind of tricks that you need to be aware of before you do that. All right, so if we look at Azure Id, we'll look at that one next. It's a bit simpler. So let's go over to Cloud Directories. And what I'll do is I'll actually walk you through the process of setting up a new Azure Cloud Directory. And so basically you give it a name and you say you want to authorize the sync. It's going to pop up the Microsoft login window. And let me find my credentials really quick. All right. And I have MFA configured, of course, so I need to find my OTP. Okay. Sure. All right, so that's going to authorize the connection, and now I can choose or select which users I would like to synchronize into this Jumpcloud environment, right? So I can just select all if I want to, or I can just kind of pick and choose the individual users that I would like to synchronize. So I'm just going to do just the one for now, so I'm not messing with the other folks here. And I will go ahead and import this user. Okay, and that's pretty much it. Now, again, one thing to consider here is, like, with respect to single sign-on, right? If you are configuring single sign-on for 365, or if you plan to configure single sign-on for 365, there's a couple important considerations to be aware of. One is that, again, let's assume that there's no on-prem AD in place, right? And it's just Azure AD. Now, if you did have on-prem AD in place, then Microsoft makes a utility called Azure Id Connect, which can sync users from on-prem AD into Azure AD, and that's fine. But again, if we assume that there's no on-prem ID in place and it's only Azure AD, then there's important consideration to make here. One is that for all of the users who already exist in Azure AD, again, if you plan to implement single sign-on, then you must first configure this directory import so that we synchronize the users from Azure AD into Jumpcloud. So that has to happen first. That's really important because if you try to configure SSO first, before you've done the user import from Azure AD, you're going to run into problems. And the biggest reason for that is that M365, well, they like to make things a bit more difficult when it comes to single sign-on and compared to most other applications because of this, this one special attribute called the Immutable Id. If you've been an admin in the M365 world for a long time, you've probably come across the Immutable Id and its quirks. But so when single sign-on occurs, when federation occurs for a user, right? In most cases, for most applications, it's only looking at the name ID value, which is almost always the email address for the user. But for M365, it's using the email value or the UPN, user principal name, and it's matching up the Immutable ID value. And if that Immutable ID value does not match in M365, the service provider, and in Jumpcloud, your identity provider, then SSO will fail. You get an error. But by completing this directory import first and synchronizing the users from Azure AD into Jumpcloud, we'll pull in that Immutable ID value, right? So we'll sync it over from Azure so that when we create that user record within Jumpcloud, we'll have that user's Immutable ID, and therefore you shouldn't run into any issues when you actually go to configure single sign-on for 365. So that's an important thing to consider. Do the directory sync first if you do plan to set up SSO. Now, in terms of why you might want to set up SSO, it really comes down to what service are you using as your identity provider. Now, if you're already using Azure AD, then you may or may not be using Azure AD as the IDP for single sign-on into other apps. You know, again, ultimately, as you implement Jumpcloud into your clients, you know, kind of, again, as we're talking about consolidation and getting everything to a single platform, you know, it's better to have everything in Jumpcloud, right? So you probably will want to, over time, transition Jumpcloud to being the identity provider for single sign-on to your other applications. And really the main benefits there is you have, again, a single admin interface to configure all those applications, a single place to enforce MFA across all those other applications, and a single streamlined user experience as well. So those are some of the reasons why you might want to configure SSO for all of your apps, but you know, especially 365. Okay, so bit of a tangent there with SSO on 365, but we're back to the directory thing here too. So I imported just this one user, and that worked successfully. So it's pretty straightforward, and we can see that the user, you know, came in here no problem. You know, and you probably noticed that the user has a password pending status, right? So I can either send an activation email to this user to make them set the new Jumpcloud password, or I can come in here and I can set their password manually for them. Right, it's a couple different options for that. But again, I mentioned yesterday, and I'll just kind of reiterate today, Azure does not give us the passwords for the user, right? So they don't provide a mechanism for us to extract the passwords. So we need to create and establish a Jumpcloud password for this user so that they can authenticate to Jumpcloud resources, right? So a Jumpcloud managed device or Jumpcloud managed applications, etc. All right, so that is the Azure setup. Trying to think if I'm missing anything on that, but any questions about Azure, feel free to drop them into the Q&A or the chat here, and I'll be happy to answer them. But it seems like we're just gonna keep on flowing right through. All right. So Google Workspace, very similar setup process, almost identical to the O365 setup, right? So if we were to set up a new Google Workspace directory integration, right? We'll authorize the sync. It's going to do the same flow over here, where it's going to take me over to authenticate this. Oops, username. Okay. All right, takes me to the consent screen, traditional OAuth consent here. I'll allow it. And then it will let me choose the users I want to sync, right? So again, very, very similar here. Right, now this user shares the same username, shares the same email address for the user I already imported from O365. Right, so it's going to tell me that it's already been registered. This user already exists within my Jumpcloud environment. So something that's good to note, you can't have a user from two separate directories that, yeah, it's basically one directory source for that user. So that's an example there. But as you can see, the actual flow to authorize that directory and import users is exactly the same for Google Workspace and Azure. Similar considerations to be made around the password, right? Google does not give us the password for security reasons, of course, but we can write the password back to Google Workspace as well. Okay, so let's see, there's a question that came up. So with O365, I understand Azure ID-based identity is necessary and the P1 license for third-party integration with JC. Is there a way to keep bi-directional sync relationship with Azure AD? How is the password challenge solved in that scenario? Can we just keep Jumpcloud as the master in that scenario? So, I mean, to the last part of the question there, yes, Jumpcloud can be maintained as the master. So, and that's kind of the ideal the way to deploy it in general, right? And, you know, again, going back to Jumpcloud is the authoritative directory source is kind of the way to think about things. So yes, we can synchronize the password to Azure, right? So we can write the password to Azure. So if a user updates their password in Jumpcloud, whether they do that from the user console or from the device agent, we can write that password back to Azure. The other consideration there as well is if you do have SSO configured for O365, then there is no password. There is no 365 password, right? Because anytime a user tries to authenticate to 365, whether that's webmail or Outlook Mobile, it will delegate the auth or redirect the user to the identity provider to authenticate. So the user would type in their email address, 365 recognizes that federation is configured and redirects the user to their identity provider's login screen. You know, so it does like an embedded web browser in the Outlook app, for example. User authenticates there, and then they're taken back over to the application. To the first part of the question there, I don't believe P1 license is necessary to integrate with Jumpcloud. I think this will work with pretty much any Azure license, even like Business Premium, E1, E3. Like I don't think P1 is necessary, but Zach, if I'm wrong on that, check me on it. But yeah, I don't think P1 is necessary. P1 just gives you some of the additional more advanced features. Like I think that includes conditional access in Azure and a few other bells and whistles around like reporting and governance type stuff, but I don't think P1 is necessary to integrate with Jumpcloud, generally speaking. Hopefully that answers your question, but if not, okay, very good, cool. All right, so that's Google Workspace. So again, very similar to Azure, and same type of thing here as well, right? Like you can do, and ultimately these integrations are kind of meant as the initial import, and then once Jumpcloud becomes the authority, you know, we can still write updates to Google or write updates to Azure, right? So again, if Jumpcloud is the authority, all changes, user creation, updates, deletions happen in Jumpcloud, and we'll propagate those out to the other directory sources. Now, similar type of thing here, since we talked about SSO for Azure, we'll cover it for Google Workspace as well. It works a little bit differently for Google Workspace. First and foremost, it's easier to set up. The 365 SSO configuration requires, the 365 SSO integration requires running a couple PowerShell scripts, or not scripts, but PowerShell commands. And we have a PowerShell module that makes that process super easy, but does require a bit of PowerShell work. The other thing that's important here too is that the 365 SSO configuration is configured and enforced at the domain level, right? So meaning if you enable SSO for acme.com, all users who have an email address with acme.com are going to be required to use that SSO authentication flow. And that can be a bit of a sticking point for actually setting it up and configuring it. You can't really test it, right? Because it's an all or nothing type thing. For Google Workspace, it's not the same. So Google Workspace is, first off, it's a much easier configuration, right? So you have just the web, the web-based GUI, the admin console, where you can make those configurations. And Google Workspace recently, I think within the past 6 months or within the past year or so, introduced the feature where you can enable the SSO either at the group level or the organization level. So you can kind of decide which users you'd like to enforce that single sign-on for. But same thing, and I talk about SSO here as a part of the directory conversation because if you enable SSO, then that eliminates the Google password or it eliminates the Azure password, right? Whereas if you're just doing the directory integration, then we can synchronize the Jumpcloud password to those directories, but the password still exists, right? So depending on how you're using it, and there's really no reason to maintain the G Suite password or the Azure password unless you're using some older legacy protocols like SMTP and things like that, which again are kind of vulnerable to attack, right? So if you're using modern authentication or federated auth, you're safer overall. Okay, so those are kind of all the primary directory integrations. I kind of briefly mentioned the HR directories yesterday. I won't get into that too much today because it's kind of it's still not all that popular, and we only have a couple directory integrations today, but those will be expanding more. Let's see. This question here, do we have instruction templates that can be sent to end users regarding their process during the conversion? Yes, we do. We do have some end user facing materials. I think especially around things like the O365 SSO, flipping that on. So there's some stuff, I think it may or may not be in our knowledge base, but we do have documentation that our implementation team can provide for that. Okay, so I think that is everything with respect to directories. Let me go back here to my other cheat sheet to see if I'm missing anything. I haven't talked about Octa. We can talk about Octa as well. So somebody mentioned that they have Octa. So we do have an integration with Octa as well. And so we can import users from Octa. The process to set it up is a little bit different. Basically, you configure it on the Octa side. You're basically configuring Jumpcloud as a SCIM endpoint within Octa. So you can assign users to the Jumpcloud application, which you can get from the OIN, right, Octa Integration Network. And then you can basically push users from Octa to Jumpcloud. Now, in this particular case, you can actually sync the Octa password to Jumpcloud. It's a little bit different, right? So, that's something that's cool. That's kind of cool and available as a part of this. And it is also real time. So anyways, most of the setup happens in the Octa environment, where you can just basically assign users in Octa to the Jumpcloud application, push them over to Jumpcloud that way, and you can get users imported into Jumpcloud in that regard. Stephen, yeah, I'll come back when we talk more about user authentication SSO stuff. I'll come back and cover the M365 integration in a bit more detail. For Zoho Directory, not today. We don't have an out-of-the-box integration with Zoho Directory, although a couple things to consider there. We do have a user API, right? So you could use our API to build a custom integration that could do that. There is also the ability to import users from a CSV. So you could do, again, kind of a custom flow, or maybe you export users from Zoho and import them into like an FTP server, the CSV, and then, pull those into Jumpcloud that way. Again, but more of a custom integration. We don't have something out of the box today. But, again, we're looking at kind of what are the top what are the top directory integrations from an HR standpoint that we want to work with, and so we'll kind of keep that in mind. Let's see. Yeah, so there's a question here. After sync with Octa, can Jumpcloud end up replacing Octa, or are there features that Octa has that Jumpcloud does not at this time? It's a really good question, and it's probably one that you'll hear from your clients, especially if they do have Octa in place already. And there's a couple different ways to position that. One is that, and this is kind of the similar position that you can use when comparing Jumpcloud to any quote unquote competitor. It's kind of unique to call others competitors, right? Because most of these like competitors, again, I'm using air quotes, are point solutions, right? Octa's a point solution. They're really great at identity management. They do SSO really well. They do MFA for web-based apps pretty well, not so much for other things like devices. But they have a really, really strong and really robust SSO solution. To directly answer the question, yes, there are some things that Octa can do that Jumpcloud cannot. Notably are things like consumer identity or CIAM, customer identity access management, or consumer identity access management, right? So if you're building a custom e-commerce application and you need to allow consumer identities to authenticate to your application, Octa has support for that. And especially since they acquired Auth0, that's really what Auth0's bread and butter is. And most of that type of functionality is centered around Id Connect and OAuth. Jumpcloud we don't currently support Id Connect for authentication into applications, but that is something that's planned on the roadmap. And I think I actually saw today that it's slated for Q2. But again, don't quote me on that. So Id Connect is one. That's probably one of the big things that Octa can currently do that Jumpcloud cannot, but otherwise, like Saml is Saml, right? It's an open standard. There's nothing proprietary to any one vendor when it comes to the Saml protocol. So that's pretty straightforward. The other thing is password management, right? Octa does have a password management capability. Jumpcloud does not have that today, but that's something else that is on the roadmap as well. Those are probably the big ones, honestly. Workflows, but again, that's a relatively new product for Octa also, and we're looking at ways of doing that too. But if you already have something like a Zapier or Trade.io or Workato, then you can do more than what Octa Workflows can do as well. So yeah, the API, yeah, I'll have Zach drop the link for the API documentation in there. I don't know it off the top of my head, but well, there it is. He's got it. Okay. Cool. Great questions all around. And guys, this is really meant for you guys. So, keep firing away at the questions. Like I mentioned at the beginning, I don't have 3 hours worth of content to show you, so we can make this as interactive as you like, and I'm happy to answer any questions and kind of divert to that type of stuff as well. All right. So I think that's covered just about everything from the user management standpoint. I guess we could talk a bit more about user groups, but we've at least covered off all the directory integrations, so we can move on from there. So I kind of talked about these a bit yesterday, but we can go into a bit more detail here. User groups are a way of assigning resources to users in bulk, right? So that could be applications, that could be resources like Radius, so VPNs or Wi-Fi access points, and things of that nature. So I'll kind of walk through a couple of things here. If we wanted to create a brand new group, maybe we want to call this, like we probably already have a DevOps group, but we'll call it DevOps 2, right? So we can create a new group, give it a name, give it a description, enable some permissions, style features for this group if we want to. And we can also create custom attributes that can be used for users who belong to this group. From here, we can assign users to it, right? So we can just kind of pick and choose which users we'd like to assign. So for example, if I wanted to assign myself and kind of all of my different test users here, I could do that. I could also match these up with device groups. I could assign applications to this group, right? So we'll choose AWS here. or I could also assign radius or directories as well, right? So these are kind of all the different types of resources that you can assign to a user group. And so in most cases, when a user is assigned to this user group, that basically means that they'll be, depending on the type of resource that's assigned to the group, right? They'll be either granted access to it or kind of bound to that specific resource when you add the user to this group. So I'll just go ahead and save this so we can kind of see what happens here, right? So that's as easy as it is to create the group. And if we come back over here, we can see, the bound users, and we can see which resources that's been assigned to that group. One of the other things here that you'll notice is that you'll see in a lot of these groups, you'll see these membership updates suggested. So like contractors, right? And this is basically kind of our automation, right? Trying to kind of guess that, hey, you call this group contractors, these users look like they might be contractors, we think they probably are, so would you like to assign these users to this group, right? So that's what those membership suggestions look like and kind of what they do, right? So it's just trying to kind of guess the users that it thinks should belong to those groups to kind of help you out in terms of assigning users to groups. I'll point out that is one of the other kind of areas that we're looking into in terms of making the admin experience easier, is having more automation around these types of things in terms of like assigning users to groups or device groups and things like that. So probably more to come on that later in the year, but just know that we currently have the suggestions, or of course you can manually assign users to groups as well. Okay, so that's mostly it for users. Cool. All right, we'll move on then. So what else do we have here? Authentication. All right, so that's a good segue into authentication. So question here from an MSP point of view, how does the billing experience look like? So that's a great question. And actually, Zach, maybe if you want to chime in on that one, I kind of touched on there's a ConnectWise integration that we have, right? So from the multi-tenant portal, you can kind of do an automated nightly sync of your user counts from Jumpcloud into ConnectWise Manage. And we're looking at ways of doing other integrations as well, like Datto and stuff like that. But that's one of the main things. But ultimately, from a billing perspective, we have, we bill based on a high watermark model, right? So within a month period, we'll look at the high watermark, right? So you might have users come and go, right? A fluctuation of users. We'll look at the high watermark to take that as kind of the user count for that month. And then that's what we use for billing purposes. But if you're using ConnectWise Manage already, then that makes things a bit easier, right? You can kind of help to automate that a bit. If your finance team can just go directly into ConnectWise to see those user counts, and then you bill your end customers. But that's the basics of it. And if you want or need some more detailed specifics, I would say we can get you set up on a meeting with one of our partner account executives, and they can kind of go through all that stuff in terms of billing, what margins look like, partner agreements, all that cool stuff. Okay, so all right, so let's kind of transition to authentication, right? So this kind of came up a little bit with Google Workspace and Office 365. So we'll dive into those ones in particular and just kind of look at what SSO looks like for other stuff. And we can actually go through the process of kind of doing a dummy configuration too, so you can kind of see what that looks like. So for Office 365 in particular, I mentioned earlier, it's kind of one of the trickier applications to configure. And I'll kind of walk you through and show you why. The biggest thing is that, like I mentioned, it does require using PowerShell and PowerShell commands to actually configure it. And that's really on the M365 side. That's kind of just how they set it up. So I'll show you kind of generally speaking the way that it works. I won't go through the entire thing, Because again, I don't want to get into the weeds of using PowerShell, but I'll kind of at least show you conceptually how it works. Right, so first thing here is this value can actually be anything, doesn't really matter. The IDP entity ID is basically just a URI value. It can really be anything as long as it matches in both the IDP and in the SP is the most important thing. Login URL, and this is actually only used for kind of specific workflows as well. So not super important, but you just throw your domain here on the end of it. Now, once you activate the connector, oh, you know what? This is not unique. This in here. Okay, there we go. So once you activate the connector, come back to it now. I just did. Right, that is what generates the IDP certificate, the IDP private key, and also the IDP metadata. Now, some of the information that's contained within the metadata here is going to be what's used for kind of running those PowerShell commands. I'll pull up the KB article here. The easiest way to look at it is, we have a pretty in-depth KB article for it. I mentioned we do have a PowerShell module that you can use for this as well. So instead of using PowerShell exclusively, you can use our PowerShell module. Makes it a little bit easier. So we kind of fill in some of the things for you and automate some of these things, right? And again, that PowerShell module can be found here in the knowledge base article. If you've already done this before for 365, it's really just using the Microsoft Online PowerShell, right? So you might be familiar with some of these commands already, right? You connect to them, self-service, and then you can modify the federation settings from there. So the PowerShell module just kind of makes things a bit easier, and this basically allows you to just upload the metadata from Jumpcloud. That way you don't have to manually copy and paste the individual values or try to figure out which values in Jumpcloud align with the appropriate values on the M365 side. So I'd recommend using the PowerShell module to do that because, like I said, you can just come over here, you download the metadata from Jumpcloud. If you want to take a closer look at this, I can kind of show you what the actual metadata looks like. But basically, this just contains the XML that's going to be used for creating that Saml trust. So that includes the certificate. It includes things like the IDP entity ID. It includes our sign-in URLs. And those are really the main things that need to be provided to M365 or any other service provider, for that matter, to set up single sign-on. So that's what the metadata looks like. It's just an XML file. But again, the key thing here is by using the Jumpcloud PowerShell module, all you have to do is import the metadata into PowerShell or define the path, and then it kind of does the rest for you. So it makes it way easier as opposed to doing the individual commands and trying to figure out like when the PowerShell MSOL is asking for like the federation URL, which one is that aligned with on the Jumpcloud side, right? So the PowerShell module just makes things way easier. So I'd recommend using that. So that's basically what that looks like. Now again, when you enable this for 365, it's an all or nothing thing. You'll notice here that we call this out that it can take up to 2 hours for the configuration to actually take effect. We have this in our knowledge base article because Microsoft puts this in their documentation. From experience, it's actually much faster than that. It's most of the time it's pretty much instantaneous. So you can expect that once you flip that switch, it's going to immediately impact user experience. And so what that means is that, for users who are used to, if they're using webmail, for example, you might go to portal.office365.com. You type in your email address and then your Azure Id password, and then you get logged in. The difference is that once you enable single sign-on with an identity provider, then you do the same thing. You go to portal.office.com, you type in your email address, and then once you hit next, it will redirect you to your identity provider's login page, right? So they would be redirected to console.jumpcloud.com, where they would be authenticating with their Jumpcloud credentials there at that point. And that's pretty much the same for any IDP, right? So if you've enabled SSO for 365 with other IDPs, then it's very similar workflow here. Now, most users don't use webmail, right? Folks are not going to O365, in their browser. They're probably using Outlook, the desktop application on their machine, or they're using the Outlook mobile application. And the nice part is that the login experience is pretty much the same, regardless of which type of client you're using. So same thing, even in like the Outlook desktop application, when you go to add a new mailbox, it asks you to type in your email address. And again, the Outlook application will recognize that that's a federated domain and modern authentication is enabled. So it'll do a pop-up window with the browser, like an embedded browser pop-up window, where it'll do that redirect to the Jumpcloud login page. User authenticates there, and now they're signed in and set up with Outlook. So again, regardless of whether they're using webmail or Outlook or the mobile application, it all works the same once you flip that on. Okay, so, and that's kind of the further look at setting up SSO with 365, but if there's any specific questions about that, feel free to pop them in, and I'll be happy to answer them. So now, again, 365 is probably one of the, maybe not the most difficult or complex to configure, but one of, right? It's probably the only one that requires you to use any type of command line interface as opposed to just a browser GUI. So things like Google Workspace, gonna be a lot easier, right? So if we look at what that example looks like, I'll come over here and we'll set up a Google Workspace application to see what that looks like. Okay, we'll come over here, provide our unique values for this stuff. All right. And again, with most of our catalog connectors, this is kind of the process that you can expect, that a lot of these things will be mostly pre-populated for you. You'll notice that I just kind of went in and changed the spots where it said your domain and put in my specific domain there in those areas. And again, that's kind of the idea with most of these pre-built connectors, that it's already going to be pre-populated with most of the basic info, so you don't have to go searching around for what that URL is supposed to be or supposed to look like. And of course, again, we'll have the knowledge base article for all of these as well, so you can read up and see what that looks like. So we'll pop over there in a second so you can get an idea. But if we activate it, again, this is where it's going to generate the new IDP certificate for us, as well as the private key and the metadata as well, right? So we can export the metadata from here, and then we would need to provide that to Google to complete that configuration. So let's take a look, right? So again, the KB article shows us all the different things that we need to know on how to set this up. On the Google side, really what we need to do is log into our Google admin interface, and then it's under, I think it's security. It's been a while since I've done it. Settings. You can probably just look at the KB article to see as well. Yeah, security and then settings. Where is show more? There we go. All right, security, authentication. Now, Google, of course, can function as an identity provider as well, right? So you'll notice there's two different options here. So setting up SSO with Saml applications, that would be if you were using Google as the IDP, or setting up SSO with a third-party IDP, and that's the one that we would want to use to set up Jumpcloud as an identity provider for Google here. Now, you may have clients that are already using Google for SSO, and maybe they're using OAuth instead of Saml, right? So if you have applications that have the sign in with Google feature, that's using OAuth, right? So Google is functioning as the OAuth provider. Now, one thing that's important to note as well, specifically for those folks who do have mostly Google environments, is that, and since we're talking about SSO and Saml in general, is that a lot of applications, and I'll kind of show you here, the SSO Wall of Shame is kind of a funny website. This is something that's good to be aware of as you're speaking with clients, is that a lot of applications will require the client to be on like the premium plan or like the higher tier plan in order to unlock the SAML or skim provisioning functionality, right? You'll notice that there's some pretty notable examples here, like Atlassian Cloud, Slack is one, GitHub, IT Glue is one that y'all are probably familiar with. So something to be aware of. It is what it is, right? Vendors get to choose how they want to price their packages, and if they want to put SAML on the higher tier, then I suppose that's their prerogative. But this is just something to be aware of because it might catch you out with your clients. So take something like Slack, for example. Slack has, I think it's 2 or 3 different tiers, and in order to get SAML authentication and skim provisioning, you have to be on their highest tier plan. But on their middle tier plan, they allow sign-in with Google. And there's some other applications that behave that way as well, where you want to use SAML authentication, you have to kind of pay extra for it on their higher tier plan. But on the middle plan or the lower plan, you can still get sign-in with Google. So if you're kind of faced with that situation, or if you come across it, it's okay, right? It's fine. You have a couple different options, right? One is that if Jumpcloud is acting as the IDP for Google using SAML authentication, and then Google is acting as the IDP for Slack using OAuth, that's okay. It still all works, right? You go to sign into Slack, you say sign in with Google, you'll get a redirect to Google. If you're already authenticated to Google, which you probably are since the session length is so long by default, then you're already done, right? It'll just say, okay, you're already signed into Google, so now Slack is authorized to use your Google identity to log you in. If you're not already signed into Google, then when the user attempts to authenticate to Google, then they would be redirected to Jumpcloud, right? So they would sign into Jumpcloud and then all the way back through. So that's how that functions. That's how that behaves. So just so you're aware, that's something I always like to point out. It's one of those kind of gotcha. So as you're speaking to your clients, good to be aware of that type of thing so that you can address it either head on or just again, right? You're building relationships with these clients, and it's good to point out these types of things that will cost them extra money, or obviously we don't want to catch them by surprise as you're trying to pitch this stuff. Okay, so that was a tangent. Back to setting up SSO for Google. If we wanted to set up the SSO profile, we set it up with a third-party IDP. And so in this case, Google asks us to kind of manually input some of this information, right? And so what we need to do here, so it's asking for the sign-in page URL. So if we come over here to Jumpcloud, that is going to be this value right here, so the IDP URL. And so we would paste that into Google. And then the sign out page URL, it's not necessary. It's not, well, it's required, but it can be basically any URL you want, right? So this is where do you want to send users when they sign out? So you can kind of choose where you want that to go, either back to the Jumpcloud console or your intranet site, like whatever. It's relatively straightforward. Domain specific issuer, this one you probably don't need to be too concerned about. This is really only, so by default, Google uses a non-specific issuer, meaning a generic issuer value. That allows you to do some creative things like have shared accounts, for example. So if you wanted to have, so like in a Jumpcloud user console, for example, you'd have a connector for their primary Google inbox, and then have a separate connector for like a it@domain.com, for example. And in order to do that and for it to work well, you have to use the non-specific issuer, right? So that's kind of the default setting. Using a domain-specific issuer is arguably more secure, but honestly, it's not that big of a deal. So don't pay too much attention to this setting. You don't really have to worry about it too much. And then you have to upload the certificate, right? So the certificate, again, you would get from Jumpcloud. You can download the certificate right here. That'll download it in a .pem format, and then you can just upload that to your Google Workspace and get it set up that way. So again, pretty straightforward. And you know, when reading through the actual KB article, it does tell you exactly what to put in, right? So I happen to know that you know, the sign-in page URL maps to the IDP URL, but the KB article will tell you that as well. And then once you have it set up, and I'm not going to do it here today fully because I don't want to disrupt the other users who are in this environment, but once you do have it set up, like I mentioned, Google does now allow you to kind of selectively enable specific groups or OUs to utilize this SSO profile. So it used to be all or nothing, just like Office 365, but Google, you know, I think it was within the past year, maybe even 6 months, they implemented a new feature where you can actually selectively choose which groups or OUs would be required to do the SSO workflow. They also give you the network mask functionality as well. So if you wanted to do that based on IP address, right? So if you have users offsite or onsite and you want to modify how the SSO flow works for those two different scenarios, they do give you that capability as well. So that's kind of cool. Google gives you a few more options to set this stuff up. But that's pretty much it. So that's how you would set up single sign-on for Google Workspace. And once you provide these values, you can save it. You're pretty much good to go. So it's a bit easier than 365. And also this, just so you're aware as well, this is kind of the standard process for most applications when you're setting up SSL. You know, you create the connector on the Jumpcloud side, that provides the metadata, you share that metadata or some of the specific values within it to the service provider, and that's what establishes that Saml trust relationship. All right, so that's kind of the deep dive on Saml SSO. Haven't seen any specific questions come in, but before we move on to something else, are there any questions about Saml? And actually, before we move on, I'll show you, if you're unfamiliar with Saml and you want to play around with it, RSA has a pretty cool web app that is a test service provider. And so you can actually configure Saml with this website, basically. So you can actually test how the flow works, and you can kind of see it working in action, again, without impacting anybody, right? Because remember, for most Saml applications, it's an all or nothing thing, right? You flip it on, it enforces Saml across the board for everybody. So you can't really test it with production applications in most cases. There are exceptions to that. Some applications do provide ways that you can either test with a subset of users, or, you know, if you have a sandbox environment, then that's of course an option as well. So you have some options for it. But if that's not a good option, then this is a good way to get some practice configuring SSL. All right, so we got, is it Yilmaz? Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. So let me read through this. So here's a business case. We want to know whether Jumpcloud has a solution for it. There's a client that, as part of its business model, has built a cloud-based SaaS customer portal that offers various services to its clients: order processing, tech support, knowledge base. They're currently relying on a built-in user database of the apps they're using to offer this customer portal. They want to centralize the client's user data in one place, like a SaaS-based directory, and they want to benefit from SSO, MFA, and zero trust as well with this directory service. So I understand Jumpcloud is the right fit for it, but it'll be very expensive for this organization since right now they're not paying anything for it using the built-in capabilities. So this sounds a bit more like a B2C style use case, right? If the client is kind of have this own application that it sounds like their end users, their clients are signing into to get these types of things, that to me sounds a bit more like a B2C use case, which, like, yeah, if we're using Saml authentication for it, it's possible, but you're right, from a cost standpoint, it doesn't really make sense with Jumpcloud from that perspective. So, and this is going back to, you know, Jumpcloud is really designed for B2B use cases, right? Not just the platform, but the pricing as well, or like B2B to B, right, through the MSP model. But for B2C use cases, there's other stuff out there that'll provide more favorable pricing models for those types of use cases, especially when the user count is in the thousands or tens of thousands or greater than that, right? Those B2C specific solutions are going to be priced more, I guess, fairly, you would say, for those types of use cases, whereas our pricing model is really centered around employees. Hopefully that answers your question. Like functionally, yes, it's possible to use Jumpcloud for that stuff, right? If it's just SSO, MFA, zero trust, like as long as the application supports the Saml protocol, it's possible. But yeah, from a pricing standpoint, if it's more of that B2C model, consumer style use case, then there might be other stuff out there that's priced differently, that's more designed for those types of use cases. Hopefully that answers your question, Yilmaz. Okay. Alrighty, so that's SSO. One of the other things I'll kind of quickly point out since we're here is, we talked about with M365 and with Google that you can use the out-of-the-box catalog connectors for that stuff. We also have the ability to create custom Saml apps as well. So if you ever come across an application which is not in our catalog, or maybe it's a custom application, right? Like in that business case that it was, or I guess Corey. I guess you go by Corey. I'll use Corey. So that business case that Corey just presented, right? If it's a custom application, right? It's not going to be in our app catalog, but you can create custom Saml connectors, and they're basically configured the same way, except that you'll need to provide a bit more information about the application. And there's really two values that are mainly important when configuring a new service provider, and that's these two right here. So it's the SP entity ID and the ACS URL, or this stands for Assertion Consumer Service URL. So the SP entity ID, that's also sometimes called the audience. So if you're looking at the service provider config, they might call it the audience, or they might call it the entity ID. And then the ACS URL, this basically just tells us, the IDP, where to send that assertion to. So those are the two most important bits of information. If the service provider gives you the ability to export their metadata, then that's the easiest way. So you can export metadata from the service provider, and you can upload the metadata here into Jumpcloud. That's the easiest way to configure it. But if they don't provide that feature, a lot of them don't. So you might just have to ask the service provider, right, your customer service rep or whomever, for that information, or sometimes it'll just display it for you in the admin interface. But anyways, the point here is that as long as the application supports Saml 2.0, then it will be possible to integrate it as long as we have this type of information for it. Okay, and then the last thing about kind of setting up applications is that you do also have the option of configuring bookmarks, URL bookmarks. And so this is just an easy way that you can put, like the little tiles inside of the user console. So, maybe it's an application that doesn't support Saml, but you still want to provide users with a way that they can just kind of click on that tile from inside the user portal and access that website, that URL. So that's what these bookmarks are used for. The only thing that you need to configure here is the name, a logo if you want, and the actual URL. The identity management stuff is irrelevant. You don't need to bother with this. And then of course you can assign it to a user group if you want to. Okay, so that's everything with respect to SSO and kind of how to get applications into the user console. So we can kind of switch gears to LDAP and Radius. I am curious, I'll kind of do another poll again for all of you, but how many of you out there are already using Radius authentication today, or LDAP authentication, and what types of things are you using that for? Obviously, Radius is typically VPN, so I'm more curious about what types of VPNs you're using. And then for LDAP, I'd be interested to learn what types of things that you're connecting over LDAP, whether that's to Jumpcloud or to an on-prem LDAP or Radius server today. So if you like, drop it into the chat or into the Q&A. Or if not, I'll just make some guesses and assumptions on what y'all are using that for. All right, I'll wait to see if stuff comes in. But so for Radius, most common use case is VPN. So if you're using Meraki, Cisco ASA, Palo Alto Global Protect, there's a ton of them out there, right? Most of them support Radius authentication, and most of them support the standard authentication schemes within the Radius protocol. And the most popular ones that I've seen are ePTTLS and MS Chat v2. There's a couple of considerations to be made there. I think we kind of briefly covered this yesterday, but I'll just kind of re-emphasize it, is that, one of the more common use cases, and let me make this a bit bigger, you probably can't read that very well. One of the most common use cases for VPN is you'll have organizations that want to layer multi-factor on top of VPN, right? They need to secure network access. And so if you're using ePTTLS, then that's fine. You can use TOTP with ePTTLS. So that'll work with the ones that I just mentioned, right? Meraki, Cisco ASA, Palo Alto, like those all support ePTTLS, and you can set that up. If your VPN appliance only supports MS Chat or MS Chat v2 with ePeep, then it won't work with TOTP. So that's an important thing to just be aware of. And that's mainly because of how the MS Chat protocol works, right? It basically does, it's kind of an exchange of the hash value, right? So the TOTP, because it's a one-time password, kind of screws up the process of exchanging that hash value. So if you're kind of faced with that option and that's the only thing that you have, or that's the only thing that your VPN appliance supports, there isn't a great way around it. There isn't really much of a workaround. However, I will say that most VPNs these days are starting to support Saml authentication. And I think I kind of briefly covered this yesterday as well. But yeah, if your VPN supports Saml authentication, then I recommend using that approach. Again, it's an easier configuration most of the time. It provides a similar user experience as Saml authentication does for any other application. So it's kind of a streamlined, similar user experience, and you'll have more options for MFA. So anyways, but if Radius is kind of your only option, right, check to see which authentication schemes it supports, and then I'll kind of show you, the actual configuration. Most of it happens on the other side, right? Like within Jumpcloud, all you're doing is adding a new Radius server configuration. You give it a name, specify the IP address where those requests are going to be coming from, and then generate a shared secret, right? Or provide the shared secret, which you've already set up on the appliance side. From there, most of the configuration happens on the other end, right? So you're basically just configuring the appliance to point towards Jumpcloud's Radius endpoint to send its authentication requests. Okay, so most of that happens over on the other side. And again, we have the knowledge base articles here for it. You can, look at the specific ones like configuring wireless access point or configuring VPN, and this is where it'll provide the actual endpoints or IP addresses that you need to send those requests to. And again, it kind of talks about, the most common use cases, right? So using for VPN with or without MFA, and then using it for wireless access point authentication. So that's the basics for Radius. So for Ldap, similar in the sense that, it's relatively simple configuration on the Jumpcloud side. You're just setting up the Ldap server, right? We generate this org DN here. I'll just do it. Well, once it's set up, you can only have one for Ldap, whereas you can have multiple for Radius. So we'll provide the org DN. So this will be used for the bind user's distinguished name, as well as a base DN if you're using a base filter. But really all you're doing here is just kind of enabling it on the Jumpcloud side. And then most of the configuration happens within the application or the appliance or the server or whatever it is that you're configuring to point to Jumpcloud. So, very similar thing. If we look at the knowledge base article, it will tell us some of the different considerations to make, right? So first you have to create an Ldap bind user. So that's basically a service account, right? So when you go over to users and create a new user, I'll show you what this looks like. We'll just call this Ldap bind, and I'm just going to throw a number on there because we might already have one. The email address isn't really important in this particular scenario. And then when you go down here, you can enable this as a bind DN, right? So that's kind of the process to create the actual service account and create a bind user. Basically, this means that this is the service account that's going to be used when you perform Ldap searches. So it's kind of like when you see, like if you looked in the event log, for example, you'd see all of the Ldap searches. They're going to be using this bind user to actually perform those searches. So anyways, you create the bind user. You would add users to the Ldap directory, right? So if we come over here, back in the Ldap configuration, we can either associate a group of users to it, or we can associate individual users to it. So you do have to associate these users to the Ldap directory in order for them to be searchable, using Ldap search, or in order for them to be able to authenticate using Ldap protocol. And this is also where you can determine whether or not you want to have Saml authentication enabled too. And then from there, right, most of the configuration would happen on within the application, right? So you configure the actual, the host name, the bind user's distinguished name, base DN, user DN, group DN, right? Again, and I mentioned this yesterday, but the schema compliance, we follow the RC 2307 schema, which is the most popular Ldap schema that's out there. So most things will be compliant with that. You can also decide, you'll notice here that we support both 389 and 636. So, 389 will be used for start TLS, 636, of course, used for LFS. So both methods are supported, and we provide the SSL cert here as well if your client does require that. Sometimes the client will require you to manually import the cert. Other times it can just automatically retrieve it from the host. Cool, a few other considerations here as well. You can kind of see some examples of how you can do Ldap searches. So these are just, you can use terminal or bash or, shell types of things to do these Ldap searches. Is a good way to just kind of test that you're able to connect to the Ldap server. Also can sometimes be a good way of troubleshooting, right? Like if you're having issues doing group-based authorization, for example, or if you're having some type of issue with a particular filter or something of that nature that your application is adding onto the search, then sometimes using Ldap search from terminal is a good way to test it out and to try to troubleshoot some of those things. And you can also see kind of example responses here also. So we'll give you quite a bit of info here you can play around with. So that's the basics of Ldap. So yeah, again, keep on firing questions away here if you guys have them, but I don't see any new ones coming in, so I'll just keep chugging along here. All right, so other stuff here. Next is around device management. So for device management, we went pretty deep on this yesterday. We went through the process of installing a new agent on a Windows device, and we saw that whole process and experience of setting up a new Windows device, binding a new user to that device, and kind of doing that from start to finish. So we've covered most of it. So then maybe for today, what we can do is play around a bit more with things like policies, and kind of show you how some of this stuff looks like. So this one is actually the device that we set up yesterday. Okay, so we have this James.training user that we associated to this device. We added it to a device group, which in this particular case didn't really do much because I don't think this device group has any policies associated to it. Indeed, it does not. So there's no bound policies to this device group. So that was kind of didn't do much for us. But if we wanted to, for example, add this to, I think if we go, let's see. I think the dev systems has a few policies on it, right? So if we assign this device to this device group, right, we'll see, okay, now we've got some policies assigned to it here. This one is probably specific to Mac though, so might not help us much. Let's look at some individual policies here. So maybe we want to block Microsoft accounts. Maybe we want to disable USB storage, disable Windows Store application, restrict control panel access, right? Let's just play around with a few of these and we'll kind of save this device and see what happens now that we've enforced some of those policies onto it. So if we look at the policies page here, we can see here which policies are enabled for it, right? Again, let's go back over here. Let's actually pull up this device and see where it's at. Okay, so again, if you recall from yesterday, the Jumpcloud agent functions on a 60-second heartbeat. So, since I've made some of those changes here in the admin interface, it should automatically push down those new policies within a couple minutes. You'll see here it says that it's not reporting currently. Again, it's because it's just a virtual machine and it was suspended. So I'd expect it to kind of catch up here within a couple minutes so we can kind of play around and see what happens. But in case it doesn't, there are, we have agent logs. So if it is reporting, then you can get the agent log directly here from the admin interface. If it's not, the KB articles that we have will show you how to get the agent logs if necessary. So that's a decent thing to kind of show you how to do here as well. There is also a Jumpcloud University course for how to troubleshoot the Jumpcloud agent. So I do recommend that, right? I briefly mentioned the Jumpcloud University courses yesterday, but if you haven't checked that out, definitely take a look there because there's some really good content and courses that you can use to first off help get a better overall understanding of Jumpcloud. But there's also specific courses like things like how to Jumpcloud or how to troubleshoot the agent, right? This one might have some broken images, but anyways, so there's KB articles for that stuff. So you could find the logs if you had to. So let's see here. Let's just do. Oh yeah, so we can see here. Let's actually look into this. So you see, there's now a ton of different profiles on this device. So if we go back here. Right, so we can see there's 13 bound users, right? So that is why there's all those new local profiles on that device. And that is a result of adding it to this device group, right? So because the device group likely has a user group associated to it as well. So that's why we had all those new profiles pop up there. But anyways, let's see, go back to policies. I'm just gonna sign out, sign back in. All right, so let's see, what are we doing? Details. Let's refresh this. All right. Yeah, so now we can see all the bound users, the device groups that it belongs to, all the policies that are being enforced for it as well, and any of the activities that have occurred, right? So like it just caught that I had just signed in and it did start reporting again, just picked back up. And again, just because there was a VM and it was kind of asleep, that's why. But now that it's back awake, it's back in action and back reporting again. And of course, this is also where you could do the security commands. You know, I kind of mentioned this yesterday. Lock, restart, shut down, or erase is all available for you here. And yeah. So yeah, if there's any specific questions about devices or device management, I can go into more detail. But otherwise, like I said, we went pretty deep on this yesterday, so I won't spend too much time on it unless there are specific things that you guys would like to learn. I'll go back to policy management, and again, you know, the most common policies are things like full disk encryption, right? If you want to enable BitLocker for a device. Right, so for example, let's try to set this up and see what happens. Let's go here, save it. You'll notice that you see how it shows the recovery key right there. You know, like I mentioned yesterday, when we are managing the encryption for a device, we'll store the recovery key here in escrow. So like, for example, here's one machine that it has enabled for, so you can actually view the key here. Use this in case you ever need to recover that disk. So that's a handy feature as well. All right, you can also look at the status here too. So you can kind of see what the status here for each one of these is. So the exit status is something that's important to note. So exit status of 1 means that there was some type of error that occurred when we tried to enable this policy for that device. Exit status 0 is success. So we'll give you some information here about how that would work, you know, so you can kind of see what's going on. It does also work for File Vault for Macs in a very similar fashion. We can escrow or hold in escrow the recovery key. So if we look at devices here, you know, we can see like for this particular device, we do have the File Vault enabled. We can view the recovery key here as well. So, yep, works very similarly for Macs. So yeah, I mean, that's one of the most popular ones is setting up disk encryption there. But you know, you can kind of browse through all of the various different policies here. We have this policy catalog that you can use, or you can kind of configure new policies also, right? So this is kind of the actual policy catalog. So like, for example, I had one person recently asked about OneDrive and kind of what's possible there, right? So you can do some pretty cool stuff here. Right, so these are some of the different settings that you can play around with for OneDrive, right? So you can kind of control how OneDrive gets used on a particular machine. As one example, right? Apply this to a device group or to a specific device. A lot of these policies do require a reboot, a restart for them to take effect. So pay attention to that stuff when you're setting these up. You can kind of see what the description, behavior, and how it gets activated or when it'll be enforced next. So that's an important thing to note. Obviously, these are filtered by operating system. So if you want to look at Mac specific things here, you can kind of see all the different things that are available here, right? Disable Siri, disable removable storage, disable guest account, right? iCloud access, how that works, lock screen, right? Screen timeouts, a login window text. This is like a help text that will display for the user when it's only on a restart though. So like when the machine first boots up, it'll show it before they go to the profile selection. So if you wanted to put like a blurb there, then you can do that type of stuff as well. And then the other thing I'll point out too, so back to Windows, you'll notice that there's one here for custom registry keys. So this is kind of the more advanced one, right, where you can kind of do some more advanced configuration if you want to mess around with the registry keys. So you can kind of do your own customizations here. But again, it is an advanced feature, so tread cautiously, but it gives you quite a lot of power to do things on the machine that you might want to. And then similarly, iOS, right, is relatively new. So this is something that we just released within the past couple months, is support for iOS. So you can kind of see some of the specific policies which are available here for iOS too. So it's a bit shorter of a list, right? There's currently 12 policies that we have available for iOS. But again, we plan to introduce more. And we also plan to introduce support for Android as well in the future. Linux, of course, similar type of thing, right? You have Linux policies. Again, there's a little kind of fewer of them. And then there's also some general recommended ones too. Question here, if we use Jumpcloud to replace AD in an O365 environment, can we still manage file access controls within SharePoint? Yes, you can. Yes, you can. And we have some documentation around that as well that we can share with you. Okay, so that's kind of everything about policies. And I briefly touched on commands yesterday. We'll jump into commands here in just a second. Another question from an MSP perspective. As an MSP, can or are we allowed to spin up, say, 2 separate JC subscriptions for one customer organization for splitting cost center reasons? What I mean is customer considers security costs, IDP in this case, related to internal employees or separate costs from to enforce security third-party contractors. So I wonder whether this is allowed or if there are restrictions. It's kind of tough to answer. I wouldn't say it's not that it's not allowed. There's theoretically nothing preventing you from setting up 2 separate Jumpcloud organizations for a single customer. I wouldn't necessarily advise it though, because you're going to run into tons of issues with regard to management, especially when it comes to the directory synchronization, especially when it comes to single sign-on. If you're using single sign-on for that customer, that's a non-starter. You can't have multiple organizations because effectively each Jumpcloud organization functions as a unique identity provider. So, and because most applications only support a single identity provider, then it's just not going to work. Also, if you're using things like Mac Zero Touch, then that's going to give you a hard time also, because you have to integrate Apple Business Manager into each of those orgs. Plus, each one functions as kind of a completely separate instance, right? So you basically have 2 different, anytime you need to configure something, you have to do it twice in 2 different places. So not the most scalable thing ever. So yeah, I suppose theoretically possible, but I think the benefits outweigh, or the benefits of doing everything in a single environment probably outweigh the benefits of having them separate. Okay, so commands. Think of this as the ability to remotely run shell or terminal or PowerShell on a device. So, if we wanted to set up a new one, for example, you can just literally run whatever type of command that you want here, right? So whether it's Linux, Windows, or Mac, you can decide how you like to run the command. So is this a root user running the command, or one of the users whose local profile on the machine? Write out your command itself here, give it a name, and decide how you'd like to run it, right? Manually, scheduled, repeating, or on a trigger, timeout, and even upload a file if you want to as well. There are some limitations around the files. there's a size limit, which is actually being increased in the near future, so it'll probably become much less of an issue in the near future, but there is currently a size limit that's relatively small. So there's the commands, right? So again, if you wanted to, anything that you can do with shell, right? Scripting, Bash, Python, PowerShell. If you can imagine it, then you can run it as a command. So it's kind of like a stopgap, if you will, or extends the capability of policies. If there's something that you'd like to do at the machine that is maybe not available in policies for whatever reason, then you can probably do it as a command instead. So, you know, we have customers that come up with all kinds of creative ways to use this type of stuff. Let's see, a question here. So if we have a client as an MSP, we manage things through our MTP, but a client has an in-house IT person, is it possible to give that user admin access to their tenant to manage the account? Yes, it is. Absolutely. So, you know, at the beginning, I showed what it looks like to create an admin in the MTP portal, but you can also create admins directly in a specific instance as well, or a specific Jumpcloud org as well. So instead of setting them up as an admin in the MTP, you would set them up as an admin in that specific Jumpcloud org, where you have a lot of the same types of capabilities where you can configure which administrator role they have. So if it's just help desk, then you know that's all you want them to do, then there you go. Or if you want them to have some kind of greater capabilities, then you can give them whatever role that you prefer. Is it possible to have browser preference for SSO application? ABC app is SSO integrated, should always be open without Edge browser. Not that I'm aware of, no. I haven't seen anything like that before. Yeah, the only times that I've run into that in the past is with like legacy applications that run in like older versions of IE compatibility mode. But the only way I could think of doing it maybe is doing through like a desktop shortcut, where you can make the desktop shortcut trigger specific, because I think you can do that with desktop shortcuts, have the desktop shortcut trigger specific browser and specify the URL. But from the Jumpcloud user console, no, that's not possible. Okay, so that's the admins in the individual JC org right there. Okay, so that's commands, kind of ran through that. MDM we'll look at really quick. So again, this is mainly for Apple. So if you have Apple devices and you want to set up zero-touch enrollment, or in general, if you have Apple devices and you want to use Jumpcloud MDM, then this is kind of a requisite for that, because it'll really unlock the broader set of capabilities for the Jumpcloud agent. Right, if you recall, if we come back over here, if we wanted to add a new Mac device, right, when we do it through the MDM enrollment profile, we have all these different capabilities. But if we don't use that MDM profile, then we're much more limited, right? We can do the machine level authentication and we can do commands, right? And we can also configure the conditional access policies that determine, you know, you can allow or deny access based on whether it's a Jumpcloud managed device. So you can do those three things, which are, you know, certainly important things. But when you do it through the MDM enrollment profile, you get all the other things as well, right? Policy management, software management, the security commands is probably the biggest one. Zero-touch enrollment, of course, through the device enrollment program, and then OS patch management, which is going to be available shortly. So for those reasons, if you do have Apple devices, that's where you would really want to set up this Apple MDM capability here. Question here, is there any considerations of looking to use Jumpcloud in a, is that directory as a service environment? Is it DAS environment? Maybe you can elaborate a bit on what you mean there. Yeah, not quite sure what you mean by desktop as a service. So yeah, for VDI and just kind of general desktop as a service types of things, most of the time, there's not a ton that we can do there. So if you're looking at something like Amazon Workspaces, for example, we're not compatible with that because Amazon Workspaces require that you have an AWS managed Active Directory that's facilitated machine authentication. Most VDI type things are somewhat similar, right? Where they're kind of dependent on Active Directory for the domain authentication. And so in most cases, we're not going to be compatible. So yeah, although we're kind of looking into ways that we can kind of address that though as well. You know, because it is something that comes up relatively often. So we're looking into it, but in most cases today, it's not compatible. But again, that's because in most of those types of scenarios, there's dependency on some type of Active Directory or like Azure AD, for example, for the Azure VDI stuff. Okay, so back to the Apple stuff here. You know, this is kind of we're not going to go through the actual configuration here, but basically within Apple Business Manager, you have to generate a certificate chain and then provide that to Jumpcloud. And that's kind of the basics of it. You can also set up default enrollment groups here as well. So when a device does get enrolled through the automated enrollment, it's automatically assigned to a particular device group. So there's some really cool stuff that you can do there. But yeah, primarily, this is what unlocks kind of all of the power of the Jumpcloud agent for Mac devices. So if you're doing Macs, then you'd certainly want to set this up. And then there's the integration with VPP as well, or the volume purchase program, where you can buy applications in bulk from Apple, and then you can deploy those out to your endpoints as well. And so that's kind of where the software management ties into, right? So again, if you're on Apple, these applications that are listed here are kind of dictated by your VPP setup. And so, but again, this gives you the ability to deploy these software packages to your Mac endpoints. Same type of thing for Windows, except Windows uses Chocolatey. So it is possible to use custom repos as well, but Chocolatey is kind of the go-to method that we use for deploying packages to Windows machines. All right, so that's kind of all things devices. So let's see, we're chugging along here, coming up on the 2-hour mark, and let's see, I'll kind of go through, I'll go through conditional access, and we'll cover that in a bit more detail again. I'll go through the compliance and reporting stuff, and then we'll probably wrap after that. So maybe another half an hour or so. Yeah, so yeah, okay. So someone here says they have issues with Windows software management. It can be a bit finicky. If you've tried to deploy it and running into issues or having errors or whatever, like feel free to reach out to support, submit a support ticket, kind of give some background details of what you tried, what failed, and that type of a thing. And they can help you out with that type of stuff. Would you run through an example of provisioning that to Windows? We can give it a shot. Let's see. So if I wanted to, Chrome is probably one of the easier ones to play with. So let's give this a try. If I wanted to deploy this to my Windows machine, we'll use this one. Hopefully it's still awake. Signed in, yeah. Let's fire this off. Oh, because of the different 13 profiles, for sure. All right, so let's see. Now it does take some time to install some of these packages, right? Like Google Chrome is a relatively large app, right? So it might take a little bit. But what we should see is if I go back to devices, so by the way, from earlier, when we enable the policies on the devices, we can see the policy results here, right? So show us if the status was successful or not to deploy these policies to the device. Similarly, with the system info, this should be able to tell us, where is it? It should be able to tell us where or whether or not the the Chrome package was successful or not, but I might be looking in the wrong spot. Yeah, I thought there should be an event. It might just be that it hasn't gone through yet, so we'll see. We'll give it a few moments to see if we can see that pop up. But yeah, we'll wait. We can come back to that and see if it pops up. Yeah, and I haven't personally played around too much with deploying software to Windows, so but, you know, certainly if you're having issues with it and you've already tried it and came across issues, then you can reach out to support and submit a ticket, and they can help you out with it as well. Is there a report that can show software installed on a device, and can Jumpcloud push an uninstall command? We can push an uninstall command. I do believe there is a report as well. It might be on the device info. So yeah, we can look together. So yeah, sorry guys, you're starting to test the limits of my technical knowledge here, which is great, but might not be able to give you the best answer on some of this stuff too, but we will try. So if we look at the device details, hardware, system info. There we go. So under programs, we can see all of the programs that are currently installed on the device. Right, yeah. And yeah, uninstall command, you could use commands to do that. Cool. So yeah, it looks like Chrome has not yet popped up here, so we can come back to that and see if we can figure that out. But beyond that, the main things that I wanted to kind of finish with was reporting and compliance and directory insights. So we can kind of spend some time doing that. So it's a good segue. So again, if we're looking at the device details, the system insights is kind of what we're looking at here. So you can filter off of whatever specific info you'd like to look at, right? So we look at disk info. If we want to look at patches, right? If we want to look at, anything else, right? System info, for example, all the stuff here is available through the system insights. Even things like Chrome extensions, right? If you want to modify the host file, for example, or view the host file, I should say. So this is all the stuff that's available through the system insights. And you can export this directly here as well. Beyond that, most of these things would be found in directory insights. So directory insights kind of captures everything that's happening within the Jumpcloud environment. So pretty much anything that happens here, whether it's an administrator changing something, whether it's a user authenticating to a device, whether a user authenticating to an application, pretty much everything that's going on within the environment would be shown here. You can filter by various different event types, filter by specific users, filter by specific devices. All that's available here. You can also look at specific views, right? So you can create custom views and kind of save these views so you can come back to them as well. So for example, maybe failed system login attempts is something that you wanted to look at, right? And you can specify which time period you'd like to see for that type of a thing. And then again, you can drill into these and look at the summary or look at the actual raw JSON as well. So this is kind of where you would find all that stuff. You can export this in JSON format, you can export in CSV format, or I think I mentioned yesterday as well, you can set up an S3 bucket to pull these events from Jumpcloud into S3. And then from there, if you really wanted to, you could do all kinds of creative stuff with it, like run Lambda functions against it and that type of a thing. And this is also just kind of as a little tidbit into insights here. The directory insights and just kind of reporting in general, which I'll show you reports next, is kind of a newer thing. It's something that we are kind of investing into. So there's more to come on this stuff, and it'll get better over time as well. Let me go back over here and look at the Chrome packages. So here we go. So this is where it shows us kind of the status of that package deployment, right? So I can see this is the device that I just attempted to push it to, still pending here, and kind of we can view the details. So status code is still 0, so it hasn't failed yet, hasn't errored out, but it's pending. That might be because my VM keeps going to sleep and it's not maintaining an active connection to it. But that's where we would see kind of what the status of those package installs are for all of the devices that we pushed it out to. Okay, let's see. You mentioned that PC Mac images can be created for a client tenant. So not really. And the tricky part about using images is, like, you can use images, sure. You can use images to deploy machines, but the Jumpcloud agent cannot be deployed as a part of that image. So you would have to do some automation to pull down the agent after the fact. So that's the tricky part there. But so yeah, you can't really use an image with the Jumpcloud agent as a part of that image, but if you wanted to run some automation to pull down after, then you could do it that way. Okay, so that was, well, we kind of covered directory insights. Let me go back to conditional access policies real quick, and then that'll probably be a good place to pause, right about 2 hours. I think that's a pretty good session. So conditional access policies, this is really centered around application access or the user console access, right? So if we wanted to create a new one, let's say we want to do it for a specific application, right? We'll just name this whatever, test CA policy. You can give it a description, change whether or not it's enabled. If we want to do it for select applications, right? So say, for example, that Google Workspace or the M365 or maybe both that I just set up, right? We'll do it for these two. So we're creating a new policy that's going to only apply to these two applications. And maybe we want to also apply a group filter, right? So maybe it's only the users who belong to that DevOps group that I created earlier as well. Right, assuming that the DevOps 2 group includes these applications I just created, right, which is what this warning here is telling us about. And then this is where we can apply conditions. So conditions could be things like device, right? So we want to make sure that users can only authenticate from a Jumpcloud managed device. It could be things like the IP address, right? Which this would use the IP lists that were previously configured. These are configured over here, where that's where you specify your IP ranges once in one place, and then you can use these for these conditional policies after the fact as well. And then also location, right? So if you wanted to only allow users to sign in from the US, for example, okay, or whatever your home country is, then we can say, okay, user must meet all of these conditions, and then what are we going to do is we're going to allow authentication, or maybe we want to allow authentication and still require MFA, or if you wanted to create more of an access deny policy, then maybe if you wanted to kind of do more of a blacklist approach as opposed to this style approach, then you could do it that way too. But this is one example where we're saying, okay, if you're going to be accessing either of these two applications and you belong to this particular user group, then I want to make sure that you're on a trusted device on my corporate network that I know about, and you're in a country that I allow, and then I'm going to require MFA also. So that's an example of a conditional access policy. So you can get really granular with how these work, and you can have, cancel this one. You can have obviously as many different policies as you like, and you can enable them or disable them as well. And again, these could be maybe you have a specific policy for each user group. Maybe you have specific applications that you want a higher level of security on, like stuff when it comes to compliance, like HIPAA or PCI, things like that. So you can get really granular to do these types of things. Question here: can Jumpcloud act as or replace a VPN? No, we can't. So we don't provide like a reverse proxy type of functionality or anything similar to that. Obviously we have security controls in place where you can do things like require access or only allow access from a trusted device, or require multi-factor to access a particular application or resource. But that's still not quite the same as VPN functionality. But we don't provide a reverse proxy type of thing, so not really a VPN replacement. Does Jumpcloud have roadmap to add more end user behavioral analysis like settings to zero trust? And on this note, do you guys have a list of CASB solutions? So we're certainly looking at ways to enhance these conditional access policies. I think Yuba is certainly a good route to go for that. I think there's pros and cons to a Yuba approach though, right? Like you either have kind of the black box approach where the admin doesn't know what's going on and how particular risk scores are generated, or you have the other approach where it makes it so complex that it's difficult to actually configure the policies. And obviously there's a happy medium there, but I think there are pros and cons to using Yuba in these types of policies. But generally speaking, yes, I certainly think that there are kind of roadmap items to invest in this area of the product. And then a list of CASB solutions. I don't know off the top of my head. Most CASBs, and then kind of the difference in the separation, I would say, is that an IDP solution like Jumpcloud is really only concerned with the initial access into a particular resource, right? Whereas a CASB solution is going to kind of pick up where we leave off and monitor what the user is doing inside of that application, right? So, we can allow the initial access, right? And we've done the user verification, identity verification, device verification, MFA. We've done all of those things, but once they're in, they're in. And then it's really on the CASB to look at, suspicious or potentially malicious behavior that the user is actually doing within that particular application, right? Like data exfiltration or whatever the case may be. And then we do have APIs that you could use to do things like block the user, suspend the user, things like that. But to my knowledge, I don't think we have any out-of-the-box integrations with specific CASB vendors. Okay, if conditional access is set for US only and user is overseas but uses a VPN to connect, will it allow that? I believe so, yeah. So location is of course based on IP address and IP lookup, so it's somewhat easy to circumvent because you can use a VPN to make it look like you're connecting from a different location or country. So it's really a mitigation technique, right? It's not a prevention technique. And that's why you would typically, at least I would recommend, if you are using a location-based conditional access policy, to also include additional conditions like the trusted device, for example, like the MFA requirement as well for access. Do you possibly have some use cases that you've been able to work with CASB vendor even at the API level? Personally, no, I haven't. I mean, I haven't been at Jumpcloud long enough to do that. I joined in about December timeframe, but I've been in the identity access management space for several years, and I know that most CASBs do have ability to kind of do like workflow automation type things. So like if a particular signal is detected, then do this. And so if the CASB that you have has that capability, then sure, it's possible, right? Like we have the API that can modify user objects or modify device objects, but it'd really be a custom solution, not really something that we have available out of the box today, at least. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. I know it's not much of an answer. It's kind of, yeah, if you build it, it's possible type of a thing. Awesome. Great questions though, overall, everyone. Really appreciate the participation. I think that's pretty much all we wanted to cover for today. I kind of got through all of the bullets on the agenda. Like I said, we probably weren't going to use the whole 3 hours, but used up a pretty healthy chunk of it. Looks like the questions have dropped off. Of course, you're always welcome to reach out to us after the fact. You know, you can reach out to the sales team, you know, and we have pre-sales engineer resources that we can loop in and involve in these conversations. And particularly, I'll kind of shed some insight there as well, right? Like the sales engineering team is, you know, our primary function is to help out with either MSPs evaluating the platform, whether for yourself or on behalf of clients, and kind of helping to scope out particular you know, sales opportunities and provide technical support for sales opportunities. If you're running into issues where, you know, you set up a free account and you're playing around and you're trying some things and, you know, running into problems or issues, then you're also welcome to reach out to support as well, right? Like file a support ticket, and we can they can certainly help you out from that perspective. Or if you're not already in contact with the partner account executive, then reach out to sales. We can get you lined up with the partner account executive. And if we need to help triage or escalate a support case or something of that nature, we can certainly do that as well. So obviously we want to be there for you guys and kind of work with you as partners, and, you know, get as many organizations using Jumpcloud as we possibly can, of course. So yeah, so certainly reach out to us if you need help with those types of things. So with that, I don't see any other questions coming in, but again, thanks all for your time. I know it's a bit of a long haul to sit here for 2 hours, but very much appreciate it. Thanks for coming to learn, and yeah, we look forward to working with y'all more in the future. So thanks everyone, and see you later.